Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself.
I was raised in a house where the rules weren't written down, but you could feel them in the way people moved. My father's boots were always lined up perfectly by the door. My mother kept the counters clean enough that the kitchen looked like it was waiting for inspection. When I was small, I thought that was just what adulthood looked like, a careful performance where nothing spilled, nothing cracked, and no one admitted they were afraid. I was a quiet kid, not because I had nothing to say, but because I learned early that some feelings earned you warmth and some feelings earned you a stare that made you wish you hadn't spoken. The boys at school were loud in a way that seemed effortless. They pushed each other, laughed too hard, took up space like they'd been assigned to it at birth. I could mimic them well enough to pass. I could throw a ball, grin at the right moments, know when to scoff and when to shrug. But the mimicry came with a tiredness I didn't know how to name. My first memory of clothing being more than clothing is ordinary, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. I was home alone after school, maybe 8 or 9, and my mother had left a basket of clean laundry on her bed. The door was open, sunlight on the quilt. I remember standing there, looking at colors that weren't mine. Soft fabric, careful seams. There was nothing sexual in it, nothing like the stories people tell when they want to make something innocent sound dirty. It was curiosity mixed with longing, the same feeling you have when you watch other families laugh in a restaurant and you can't explain why you want to sit with them. I touched a blouse with the tips of my fingers like it might burn me. I remember how light it felt. I remember thinking, with the bluntness only a child has, that it was unfair that some people got to wear things that looked like they belonged to a whole different emotional world. I didn't even have the words for girl clothes yet, not in a moral sense. I just knew they belonged to my mother, and that my father would never wear them, and therefore I was not supposed to want to. I didn't put anything on that day. I stood there, touched fabric, then walked away and pretended I hadn't done it. But something had been opened inside me, not like a door you walk through, more like a window you suddenly notice has always been there. As I grew, the rules about gender got louder. Adults taught them without meaning to. Man up. Don't cry. Boys don't, followed by whatever emotion was inconvenient for the room. I learned that masculinity wasn't just how you dressed, it was how you endured. It was a kind of silence, a way of swallowing your own softness until you could no longer tell it existed. I became good at endurance. I became good at being helpful. I carried groceries, fixed little things around the house, nodded when people praised me for being a good young man. Those words always landed strangely in me. I wanted approval, yes, but I also felt like I was being thanked for something I hadn't chosen and didn't fully understand. In middle school, I started noticing that my attention drifted in ways that confused me. When the other boys whispered about girls' bodies, I felt uncomfortable, not because I didn't find anyone attractive, but because their focus seemed sharp and hungry while mine was hazier, like I was watching from the wrong side of glass. I watched how girls moved, how they held their shoulders, how their friendships had a softness that didn't rely on insults to stay safe. I remember thinking that I didn't just want to be close to that world. I wanted to understand it from the inside. Around that same time, I began to steal moments. Not from people, from time. 10 minutes when no one was home. A Saturday morning when my parents were in the yard. I would go into my mother's closet and stand there, feeling the air change. The closet smelled like perfume and folded cotton. I would take something down and just hold it against myself, like checking the size of a life I wasn't living. Sometimes I would put on a skirt over my shorts and stand in front of the mirror, heart pounding like I was committing a crime. The mirror didn't show me a joke. It didn't show me a spectacle. It showed me a kid with a tense face and uncertain hands, trying to make meaning out of fabric. The feeling I got wasn't excitement. It was relief. A loosening in my chest, like I could breathe in a way I didn't know I'd been holding back. Then the fear would come. Not fear of the clothing, but fear of what it meant. Fear of being caught. Fear of being laughed at. Fear of being seen as something disgusting, because that's what the world taught me would happen. I would take everything off quickly, fold it the way I found it, erase evidence like a detective, then sit on the edge of my bed with my hands shaking and tell myself I would never do it again. Of course I did. By high school, I'd become what people call normal. I played enough sports to be safe. I had a few close friends, the kind who would show up at your house and raid your fridge. I dated a girl once, briefly, mostly because it seemed like the next step in proving I belonged. She was kind, and I liked her, but I felt like I was acting in a play where I'd learned the lines but not the character. When she held my hand, I felt warmth, but also an odd distance, like I was watching myself from above and trying to calculate what I was supposed to feel. At night, in my room, I'd scroll early internet forums on a cheap computer, searching words that made my face heat with shame. I didn't know what to call myself. I didn't even know if I needed to call myself anything. I found stories of crossdressing that were written like confessions and stories that were written like jokes. I found harsh opinions and cliches. None of it felt like me, not fully. Most of it seemed to treat the act like a punchline or a secret indulgence. But for me, it wasn't about thrill. It was about honesty. It was about the quiet knowledge that there was a part of me that responded to softness the way plants respond to light. I told no one. I didn't have language for a healthy conversation about it. I didn't have models. I had only the cultural warning system. This makes you weak, this makes you suspect, this makes you a target. So, I did what many people do when they have an internal truth they can't share. I split myself. I made a version of me for the world, and a version of me for the mirror. The split was efficient at first. Then it became exhausting. College gave me space, and space is dangerous when you've been living in tight rooms your whole life. I had a dorm, roommates who came and went, a campus where no one knew my parents, a city where I could walk down a street and be anonymous. The first time I bought clothing for myself, I did it like someone buying contraband. I walked into a thrift store, hands sweating, and picked a simple cardigan and a pair of jeans that could have been anyone's. I told myself it was just for comfort. I told myself I was experimenting like everyone else in college. Then one night, alone, I tried them on. The cardigan hung differently than my own clothes. The jeans sat on my hips in a way that made me stand up straighter. It wasn't that I looked like someone else. It was that I looked like me with fewer walls. I started to crossdress in private more often, and with that came an emotional shift I didn't anticipate. When I dressed in that way, I became more willing to feel. I would listen to music and actually cry. I would write in a journal and not censor myself. I would imagine conversations where I spoke gently instead of defensively. It was as if the clothing gave me permission to access parts of my personality that masculinity had kept behind a gate. And I hated that I needed permission. That's the part people don't always understand. It isn't always about wanting to be someone else. Sometimes it's about wanting to be allowed to be yourself without punishment. I also began to notice something darker in me. Resentment. Not toward women, but toward the whole system. I resented that softness was treated as feminine and therefore inferior. I resented that vulnerability had to be earned through collapse. I resented that I couldn't tell my closest friends the simplest truth, that I was exploring my identity and it mattered to me. I feared they would decide I was either joking or broken. It was around then that I met Mara. That's not her real name, but she deserves the dignity of privacy. And I owe her that much because she changed my life in ways I'm still trying to articulate without turning her into a villain or a saint. People like simple roles. They want someone to blame or someone to worship. Real life rarely offers that. Mara was a friend, a guide, a protector, and at times an obstacle. She was also a person with her own history, her own scars, her own reasons for doing what she did. I didn't know that at first. I only knew the feeling of being understood. We met through a campus mental health group, the kind of circle where people sit in cheap chairs and learn to speak without apologizing for existing. I didn't go because of crossdressing. I went because I couldn't sleep. I was carrying the split self into every day, and the effort of keeping it hidden was turning into anxiety that came out as irritability and numbness. I was afraid I was becoming cold. I didn't want to become cold. My father was cold in the way people get when they're afraid of their own feelings, and I had promised myself I would not turn into that. Mara spoke with a steadiness that made you lean in. She didn't perform vulnerability. She practiced it. She asked questions that weren't invasive, just honest. After a few meetings, she and I started talking outside the group. We'd walk across campus, sit with coffee, complain about classes, talk about family. She made me feel like my interior life wasn't a liability. One evening, after weeks of circling the subject, I told her, "Not everything, just enough." I said, quietly, that I sometimes wore women's clothes in private and that it made me feel calmer and more like myself, and that I didn't know what it meant. I watched her face for disgust. I watched her for amusement. I watched her for that subtle tightening people do when they decide you're not safe. She nodded like I'd told her something human. She said, "Thank you for trusting me." Then she asked, "What do you feel when you do it?" Not, "Why do you do it?" as if it were a problem to solve. What do you feel? It was the first time someone had asked me that question out loud. I didn't realize how badly I needed it until my throat tightened and I had to look away. I told her about relief, about breathing, about softness, about the way my emotions seemed to have more range. She listened as if I were describing a landscape she'd been to before. And maybe she had in her own way. She didn't tell me what label to use. She didn't tell me I was definitely one thing or another. She said, "You don't have to rush to a conclusion, but you do deserve to be safe with yourself." That sentence lodged in me. Over the next year, Mara became the person I leaned on. When I had panic attacks, she knew how to ground me without humiliating me. When I spiraled into shame, she could name it and separate it from reality. She also pushed me, gently, to face the way secrecy was shaping my personality. "Secrets don't just hide one thing," she told me once. "They rearrange everything around them." I started therapy. I started writing more. I started talking to myself in a kinder voice. I also started experimenting in small, controlled ways. Not public at first, just in private spaces where I could pay attention to my feelings without fear. I learned that I wasn't chasing a costume. I was exploring a relationship with gender expression and identity that didn't fit the narrow boxes I'd been given. But the mind, like certainty and uncertainty, can turn into obsession. I found myself thinking about it constantly, not because it was thrilling, but because it was unresolved. The more I tried to control it, the more it pushed back. I would tell myself I was fine, then spend hours reading other people's stories late into the night, hungry for a map. That's when Mara's role began to shift. It happened gradually. She started offering suggestions that sounded helpful, but carried an edge of authority. "Maybe you should try moisturizing," she said one day, like it was just a normal self-care tip. "It might help you feel more comfortable in your skin." Another day she said, "Your clothes look harsh on you. You'd look better in softer fabrics." Sometimes she'd point out how tense I was and say, "You'd feel better if you stopped fighting yourself." None of that is wrong on its own. People encourage each other to take care of themselves all the time. The difference was the feeling underneath it. It wasn't just support. It was direction. And I was in a vulnerable place where direction felt like safety. I had always been responsible, the kind of person who didn't drink too much, who didn't do reckless things. But I was reckless in one quiet way. I gave Mara my trust completely. Not because she demanded it outright, but because she seemed to hold me together when I couldn't. When someone becomes your anchor, you stop asking if they have the right to be. Around that time, I went through a depressive stretch that scared me. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow kind, where you keep showing up but you feel like you're watching life through fog. I stopped eating well. I slept at strange hours. I missed a few classes. I told myself it was just stress. Mara noticed. She asked me to come over one evening. She said she'd cook. Her apartment was tidy, warm. She put music on low, chopped vegetables, asked me about my day. I remember sitting at her small table watching her hands move with confident rhythm and thinking, absurdly, that I wanted to live in whatever part of the world made someone move like that without fear. After dinner, she gave me tea and said, "I want to help you, but I need you to be honest with me. Are you thinking about hurting yourself?" The question hit me like cold water. I hesitated, then admitted that I had thoughts sometimes, not plans, but thoughts that came like a whisper when I was tired. The kind of thought that says, maybe it would be easier to disappear. Mara's face changed, not into panic, but into something harder. "You can't play with that," she said. "You can't flirt with self-destruction and call it a thought. You need help and you need structure." I agreed. I was scared. And when you're scared, structure looks like rescue. That night, she offered me a small bottle of supplements. "Just vitamins," she said. "Nothing weird. They'll help your mood and your skin. You're depleted. Trust me." She had always been careful with language, always telling me to consult professionals, but she also had a way of speaking like she'd already done the research. She told me she had a background in health sciences, that she understood biochemistry better than most people. I didn't verify it. I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. I took the bottle because it felt like she was handing me a rope. The changes were slow enough that I could pretend they were coincidence. My skin did feel softer. I attributed it to better hydration, to the moisturizers she'd recommended, to reduce stress. My emotions shifted, too. I became more tearful at things that would have made me shrug before. I felt tenderness in my chest when I watched a movie or heard a song. I told myself that was therapy working. I told myself I was becoming healthier. Then my clothes began to fit differently. It started with a shirt that felt tight across my chest. I thought I'd gained weight. I changed my diet. I exercised. The tightness didn't go away. My face looked subtly different in the mirror, not in a way I could point to, just a softness around the edges. My body hair seemed thinner. My energy shifted, not lower exactly, but different, like the aggression I used to run on had been turned down and replaced by something quieter. One day I was in the bathroom after a shower, and I noticed that my nipples were more sensitive than usual. That detail embarrassed me, even though no one was there to witness it. I stood in front of the mirror and stared at my own chest like it belonged to someone else. I told myself I was imagining things. I wasn't. I went to a clinic. I told the doctor I'd been experiencing changes, and I wanted blood work. I didn't tell her about the supplements at first because I was still clinging to the idea that Mara was safe. The doctor asked careful questions, and slowly, my answers began to sound like a confession, even though I wasn't confessing anything immoral. She asked what I was taking. I named a few things, then hesitated, then mentioned the bottle Mara had given me. The doctor's eyebrows lifted slightly. She asked to see it. I didn't have it with me. She told me, gently, that I needed to stop taking anything not prescribed. She ordered labs. When the results came back, I sat in a small room with a poster about mental health on the wall and listened to the doctor explain that my hormone levels were not typical for my assigned sex. She asked directly if I had been taking hormones. I felt my face go hot. I said no. She looked at me with the kind of calm that doesn't accuse but doesn't pretend either. She said, "Then someone has given you something you didn't consent to, or you've been exposed to something you don't know about. Either way, this is serious." I walked out of the clinic into bright afternoon sun and felt like I was floating above my own body. The world looked the same. People laughed, carried backpacks, crossed streets. I felt like I'd been handed proof that my life had been quietly altered while I was trying to survive. I confronted Mara that night. I can still hear my own voice in my memory, thin and shaking. I held the bottle in my hand like evidence. I asked her what it was. She looked at it, sighed, and sat down as if she'd been waiting for this moment. She didn't deny it. That was what shocked me most. She didn't scramble. She didn't pretend. She said calmly that she had added something to help align me with myself. She said she had watched me suffer, and she couldn't stand it. She said I was destroying myself with repression, and that she had intervened because I wouldn't. The betrayal landed in layers. First, the simple fact. She had put something in my body without consent. That is a violation. No amount of good intention makes it anything else. Second, the implication. She believed she knew me better than I knew myself. Third, the cruelest part. A piece of me had enjoyed the changes, and I hated myself for that because it felt like it would weaken my right to be angry. I told her, "You took my choice." She nodded. I did. I remember waiting for her to look ashamed, to apologize, to crumble. Instead, she looked resolved. Not proud, but certain. She said, "You were headed somewhere dark. You were shrinking. I've seen what repression does. I've seen people die from it. You needed a push. I said, you don't get to push me with my body. That was the first time in our friendship that my voice sounded like my own. It was the first time I felt anger without turning it inward. It was also the first time I realized how easily desperation can make you accept unacceptable things. I left her apartment and walked for hours. I didn't know where I was going. I felt grief, rage, confusion, and an unexpected wave of sadness that wasn't just about what she'd done, but about what it revealed, that I had been so hungry for guidance that I'd handed someone else the steering wheel. In the days that followed, I spiraled in a different way. Not into depression, but into frantic accounting. What had changed? What would change? Could it be reversed? Did this mean something about who I was? Was my sense of relief in feminine clothing real, or had I been manipulated into feeling it? I felt contaminated by the question itself. I hated the idea that someone else's violation could become part of my identity story, because identity should be something you explore with agency, not something done to you. I went back to the clinic. I told them the truth, that a friend had given me supplements and that I now believed they contained hormones. The doctor's expression softened into something like sorrow. She explained options, stopping immediately, monitoring levels, possible effects, referrals to specialists. She also urged me to consider reporting what happened and to seek support because medical violation can be traumatic in a way people underestimate. I did two things that week that likely saved me from turning this into a lifelong wound. First, I told my therapist everything. Not just the violation, but my complicated feelings. My therapist didn't simplify it for me. She didn't say, well, at least you learned something, in that toxic silver lining way. She treated it as what it was, a breach of trust, and also a moment that forced me to confront my own suppressed desires. She helped me hold both truths without letting either erase the other. Second, I told one friend. Not Mara. Another friend from the mental health group, someone I trusted but hadn't leaned on as heavily. I expected awkwardness. Instead, he said, that's not okay. Whatever you're figuring out, it should be yours. Hearing that from someone who wasn't in the middle of it gave me a kind of clarity. It was like someone handed me a mirror that wasn't warped. As my body slowly adjusted after stopping the supplements, I felt like I was living in an in-between state. Some changes eased. Some lingered longer than I expected. My emotions continued to feel closer to the surface, and I couldn't tell how much of that was biology and how much was the result of finally acknowledging myself. There were mornings I woke up furious at Mara, and mornings I woke up missing her because she had been my anchor even if she'd also been the storm. That's the cruel mathematics of betrayal. You don't just lose the person, you lose the version of yourself that felt safe with them. I avoided her completely at first. Then she reached out with messages that didn't apologize, so much as justify. She said she did it to save me from myself. She said she couldn't watch me self-destruct. She said she knew I would never choose it because I was too afraid. I didn't reply. I needed to build a life where my choices were mine again. I needed to rebuild my sense of responsibility because part of me wanted to stay in the victim role forever. It's tempting because if you are only a victim, you never have to take the frightening step of deciding what you actually want. But I did want something. I wanted to explore gender expression without fear and without coercion. I wanted to know myself in a way that wasn't reactive. I wanted to become the kind of person who could feel deeply without collapsing. So I started small and honest. I stopped treating crossdressing like a forbidden ritual and started treating it like information. When I wore feminine clothing in private, I paid attention to what I felt. Was it relief? Was it anxiety? Was it joy? Was it sadness? Sometimes it was all of them. I noticed that certain items made me feel like I was hiding, like I was playing a role. Other items made me feel simply comfortable, like I was allowing myself softness. The difference mattered. I also learned that identity exploration doesn't have to be all or nothing. The internet often pushes people toward extremes. Either you're just doing it for fun, or it means everything about you must be rewritten immediately. Real life is more gradual. Sometimes you try something, and it fits. Sometimes you try something, and it doesn't. Sometimes what fits changes as you grow. The healthiest thing I did was allow myself ambiguity without treating it as failure. I began to think about my family again. My parents were still in my life, still proud of the version of me they understood. I didn't know how to bridge the gap without detonating everything. I also knew that hiding forever would harden me. I didn't want to become a person built of concealment. In my last year of college, I told my mother a partial truth. Not the whole story, not Mara, not hormones. I told her I'd been struggling with anxiety and identity, and that I sometimes found comfort in expressing myself in ways that weren't traditional for men. I expected anger. What I got was silence, then tears, then a question that surprised me. Are you safe? That question didn't solve everything. My mother didn't suddenly understand. She worried. She asked if I was being influenced, if I was depressed, if I was being harmed. But underneath the worry was love. She didn't throw me out.
She didn't mock me.
She didn't call me disgusting. The relief I felt in that moment was physical. It was like stepping out of a locked room and realizing the lock had been partly in my own mind. My father was harder. When I eventually told him, he went quiet in a way that felt like the air leaving a room. He said very little.
He didn't yell.
He didn't insult me. In some ways, that was worse, because I could see the conflict in him with no language to soften it. He had been taught that masculinity is a narrow bridge, and anything outside it is dangerous. I watched him stand on that bridge, and not know how to reach me. Over time, he improved in small increments. He would ask, awkwardly, if I was okay. He would say he didn't understand, but he loved me. Those words mattered. They weren't perfect. They were effort. Effort is what love looks like when people are learning. I wish I could say that after that, everything became smooth. It didn't. Life doesn't work like that. I still wrestled with shame. I still felt the social pressure to be legible. People want to categorize you quickly, so they know how to treat you. I learned to set boundaries. I learned that I didn't owe everyone an explanation. I learned to choose who earned my truth. I also had to face the question Mara's violation left behind like a splinter. What did I want for my body? This is where I have to speak carefully because my goal in telling the story isn't to tell anyone what their identity should be. It's to show what responsibility looks like when you're confused. For me, the answer was to take my time, to work with professionals, to make decisions based on sustained understanding, not on panic, not on pressure, not on someone else's certainty. I learned that mental health and identity exploration are intertwined but not identical. Anxiety can make you doubt everything. Depression can make you reach for any escape. But identity exploration, when done with care, can also be a source of resilience. It can teach you to listen to yourself. It can teach you to reject social scripts that harm you. It can teach you empathy for others who live outside norms. Crossdressing, for me, became one thread in a larger fabric. It wasn't the whole story. It was a tool for self-understanding. It helped me recognize how much of my masculinity had been performance and how much of my softness had been hidden to survive. It also forced me to confront my own biases. I had internalized the idea that feminine expression was lesser, and I had to unlearn that, not just for myself, but for how I treated others. Years passed. I graduated. I got a job. I moved to a new city. I built routines that didn't depend on secrecy. Some days I dressed in a traditionally masculine way because it fit my mood and my environment. Some days, in private or in trusted spaces, I dressed more femininely because it helped me feel aligned. Over time, the act lost its sharpness. It stopped being a crisis and became a choice. That, more than anything, was healing choice. I eventually heard through mutual acquaintances that Mara had left the city. We never reconciled. For a long time, I fantasized about confronting her again, delivering a perfect speech that would make her understand. But the older I got, the more I realized that closure isn't something you extract from another person. It's something you build by living well. I can hold compassion for the pain that might have driven her to do what she did, and still name her action as wrong. I can acknowledge that my suffering was real, and still take responsibility for my healing. I can admit that the experience forced me to face myself, and still insist that coercion is not guidance. Those are complicated truths, and adulthood, I've learned, is mostly made of complicated truths. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in any part of it, I want to offer something practical, not dramatic. First, if you're exploring gender expression, you deserve safety. That means emotional safety and bodily autonomy. No one should pressure you into a label, a presentation, or any physical change. Guidance is not control. Love is not possession. Second, secrecy can feel protective, but it has a cost. If you can find even one trustworthy person, a therapist, a support group, a friend with emotional maturity, let yourself be known in small pieces. You don't have to hand over your whole story at once. You can build trust gradually. The point is not exposure. The point is not living alone inside your own mind. Third, it's okay if your identity doesn't fit a neat narrative. It's okay if you have days of clarity and days of confusion. It's okay if you crossdress and still identify as a man, or if you crossdress and realize you're something else, or if you crossdress and later decide it was a phase of exploration that taught you something. The only unethical path is the one where you harm yourself or others to avoid facing the truth. And finally, if you've ever been betrayed in the name of help, I want you to know that your anger is not proof you're ungrateful. Anger is often the part of you that knows you deserved respect. The work is to let that anger protect you without letting it poison you. I'm still learning. I'm still integrating. I don't tell this story because I have everything figured out. I tell it because the years I spent split in two were years I can't get back, and I don't want anyone else to lose time to shame if they can avoid it. I also don't want anyone to mistake coercion for care, or to believe that someone else can save them by taking away their choices. We save ourselves the slow way with honesty, support, boundaries, and the courage to be imperfect in public and still keep going. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.